Everybody, and welcome to Broadband Deployment News. Today I'm going to be going over part 2 of the NTIA's Broadband Access Report. Be right back. Thanks for joining me. Rick Usda here with Zcorum. And yesterday I went through part 1 of this report that the NTIA just put out this month on basically the federal government's efforts on getting broadband deployed, getting broadband adoption up. This is something that's required by the Consolidated Appropriations Act that was passed a little while ago. So the NTIA released a report. I did part 1 yesterday, and today I'm going to be looking at part 2 of this. So this is the report. Again, this is the NTIA, which is a agency underneath the Commerce Department, Department of Commerce. And as I mentioned yesterday, there's lots of layers of bureaucracy. If you look at that, there's another department under this. I forget the name of it. It's in here somewhere. That is required to. Oh, it's the Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth. So they're required, as part of this act that was passed, to be providing this report annually. This is their first report, and I talked about part 1 yesterday, which had this information in it. And today I'm going to be talking about part 2, tracking report methodology findings and the path forward. And there's really not a lot in here because of the fact that they don't have everything in place yet to be able to do the reporting. They've got some challenges, but we'll talk about that as well. So I'm just going to scroll down way through here towards part 2 once we get to that. Is that it there? Yeah, part 2. So tracking federal broadband investments. So they talk about the report methodology here. The Access Broadband Annual Report will evolve, and it's going to need to evolve as the OICG collaborates with interagency colleagues to determine the appropriate methods to answer the questions set out in the mandate. So they're mandated to create this report, and this first report is trying to figure out how they're going to do this, basically. How and where the funds, they're supposed to report how and where the funds were invested and by which program, how many U.S. residents were connected and by which program, and what's the estimated local economic impact of broadband deployment efforts. So those are the 3 things that this report is supposed to include on an annual basis so that we know as taxpayers, when we're paying our taxes, we can see where this money is going. We can make sure that it's being effective as far as deploying broadband and getting people to hopefully adopt it. They talk about their framework here, inputs, activities, outputs, etc. They go into a little more detail. It makes sense, I guess, what they're talking about doing. So they've got their proposed broadband logic model. They've got inputs that would be, infrastructure deployment funding. So they're providing funds for that. They're providing funds for digital inclusion to try to make sure that all people are included, all people from all areas of the country. Planning data and mapping funding, that's all important as well. And then they've got the activities that would be associated with that, obviously. So deploying the actual infrastructure, establishing the actual digital inclusion programs, and getting the actual planning projects and collecting the data. So then outputs, new infrastructure. I would think also there'd be new mapping and some other things down here, but they mentioned new infrastructure. Immediate outcomes, increased broadband availability. That would be immediate, not so immediate in some of these programs because for the IIJA, for example, the infrastructure bill that just passed recently, it's probably going to be 2023 maybe before we see any actual broadband infrastructure deployed, but that's a short-term goal. And then there's other funds that right now are being allocated or have been allocated through CAF2, through RDOF, through ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act, that funds are already being applied for and delivered on some of those. So intermediate outcomes would be increased broadband usage. So if you build it, they will hopefully come, right? So you go out and build a broadband, and but then you need to come have people make use of it. And then long-term outcomes, hopefully improved economic outcomes for people wherever they happen to live, even low income areas, for example. Outcomes may vary in terms of how long they take to achieve, yes, and may stretch into years, especially in the case of broadband infrastructure deployment. It can take many years to build infrastructure to expand broadband availability within a region, many more to see increased broadband usage. Alternatively, a digital inclusion or adoption program providing service subsidies may result in increased use within months. So that's, for example, if the infrastructure is already there and you've got a program like the Emergency Broadband Benefit, for example, that provided subsidies for broadband because of coronavirus, and then the IIJA has under it the Connect programs, taking over for the EBB. Those kinds of things can have a more immediate impact because subscribers in the area can apply for those subsidies. Federal program data sources. The government's conducted a number of efforts to collect and consolidate federal broadband program data. While these sources are productive efforts to aggregate data from across the federal government, they were not intended to track detailed breakdowns of the type of broadband funding use, for example, infrastructure, digital inclusion or adoption, geolocation information on the areas of use, or program outcomes. Thus, they do not collect the data fields needed for this report. So they're starting off the bat here saying, hey, we don't have everything we need to be able to provide the results portion of this report. OICG will continue to explore these other sources of program data and coordinate on reporting measures with agency partners in future years to improve tracking of federal broadband investments. Then they talk about socio-economic data sources. In future years, socio-economic data sources will inform the usage and economic impact analysis components of the report. National economic and internet use data sets will be critical to track investments across the full life cycle of federal broadband programs and evaluate associated impacts on the lives of U.S. residents and local economies. So again, they need to get methods in place to track that socioeconomic data as well. Their report approach 2021, again, kind of explaining that they can't really get everything they need, but they designed the 2021 report. The approach is to understand the data currently captured by federal programs that allow funding for broadband and catalog the challenges programs face in collecting, sharing, and reporting on broadband data. So in other words, they're trying to make this report a report on what they don't know, basically. So what they don't know or what they can't provide at this point. And then try to figure out how to do it, I guess, in the future. So limitations of findings. As a cross-agency data aggregation effort, this first year of tracking federal broadband investments depended on existing practices around federal broadband data collection, analysis, and reporting. So they can only use what was already in place. The lack of standardization across the government, imagine that, lack of standardization, including in how programs identify as broadband support programs, limits the ability to draw broadband conclusions about the scope of federal investments. And this is a problem in that we have several agencies over time that have been tasked with providing broadband funding for either infrastructure or for inclusion, getting adoption up, those kinds of things. And you give it to one agency, they do it one way. You give it to another agency, they do it another way. You had different bills that define broadband in different ways, and unserved and underserved areas in different ways. So yeah, it's difficult. They're having to make do with several different programs and agencies that don't have data that matches. Should not be treated as a comprehensive view of the federal broadband funding landscape because of this lack of data. Inconsistent data collection practices across the federal government included appropriated, obligated, and outlaid funding for programs fiscal year 20. Often do not match up within a fiscal year due to the lags in timing between when funds are appropriated, obligated, and ultimately outlaid to fund recipients. So you can have your goals and what you're planning on appropriating and obligating and giving out, but then again, that may not match up because there's the lags and delays and those kinds of things. NTIA will explore options to enhance the accuracy and consistency of data provided with the goal of producing an annual report with a replicable process that allows Congress and the American public to understand where federal investments were made, the results of those investments, and ultimately a connection to economic impacts in those areas. So that'll all be good, but it's definitely going to be at least a year. Hopefully next year during the next year, hopefully they'll have put in place some methods and gotten with all of the various stakeholders and those that are collecting this data and said, hey, we need to get this next year and need to provide a report that has some real meaning to it. And you can tell in this report, I think, that some of the agents were like, hey, we just don't have this as we go through this. So Table 1, list of responding federal broadband-related programs. So these are the programs that responded, and some of them, some of them I recognize, some of them I just was not even aware were around, like this Alaska broadband program. But you got the Connect America Fund, see it, CAF 1 and CAF 2. This is really probably CAF 2 here, yeah, CAF 2, Phase 2 auction. You've got E-Rate, which provides funds for libraries and schools for telecommunication services. You got RDOF, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which the auctions have taken place, but the money is just now starting to be allocated from that. So that's something that is just now starting to happen. And this was, let's see, this is by, yeah, this is the FCC here. So you've got your agencies. These that I did here, the FCC, then you've got the USDA, you got the Reconnect program. There's also a Telecommunications Infrastructure program, that's a big one. U.S. Department of Commerce, I noted that here because I don't see anything from them related to ARPA, the American Rescue Plan, or anything else here. It doesn't have the current infrastructure bill, which the U.S. Department of Commerce is going to be managing, but obviously nothing's been obligated or allocated to that. That's just brand new, so that's not in here. Department of Education, some others. So those are some of those programs. And it's got different kinds of broadband programs. Again, it's broken down into 3 categories. You got infrastructure deployment, building, all of the fiber and the wireless, whatever it is that you're building, digital inclusion or adoption, and then planning, data, or mapping, which is important to make sure that we know who is unserved or underserved. Got your large broadband programs that they identify. That would be funding over $500,000 in fiscal year 2020, reported by the USDA's Rural Utilities Service and the FCC, which outlaid the overwhelming amount of broadband-related funding in 2020. Small broadband programs below $500K, reported by Denali Commission, Department of the Interior, and National Science Foundation. And that's just the 3 that happen to report, so there's more of those. Then there's multi-use programs. So in some of these programs, they are specifically like, okay, this is all about broadband. For example, BEAD, the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment, that's part of the Infrastructure Act, is all broadband, right? And there's other things in there, like there's a broadband adoption portion of that, but you know that it's broadband. And some of these multi-use programs, like it might be housing, and then just some of those funds could be used for broadband. If it's, if you're going to have a housing bill or housing funds, then you could use some for broadband, but it's not necessarily really well defined as to how much can be spent for broadband, whether it was spent for broadband or not. It says here it's often challenging or not possible for programs to break down their funding to illustrate what portion was spent on broadband or different types of broadband activities, such as infrastructure deployment versus digital inclusion or adoption. So it may be that it went to broadband, but they don't know if it was for infrastructure or getting people to use the service. So our large broadband programs, it says 19 large broadband programs responded to this year's data request, all from the USDA and the FCC, which again, that was most of the money that was allocated. So you've got your also Department of Agriculture here, USDA. Within USDA, RUS provides funding for infrastructure or infrastructure improvements to rural communities, including water and waste treatment, electric power, and telecommunications services. And then the FCC, of course, and its broadband programs are primarily focused on funding infrastructure and digital inclusion or adoption projects. So they've got the large broadband program funding here. And again, I highlighted a few that are more familiar, like the Reconnect program, USD Reconnect. I did a broadcast about that a few weeks ago, so I'll go ahead and link to that here. If you want to know more about the Reconnect program, there's money right now that's available. So if you're interested in broadband infrastructure, you're kind of waiting on the Biden infrastructure bill that passed recently, that's going to be a while. It's going to be a long wait before you get those funds. It's first got the government has to send a notice of funding opportunity to the states, and then the states need to then be making a 5-year plan and finding out who in the state, which operators, municipalities, or co-ops, nonprofits, who's going to be providing the broadband. They need to apply, so there's a lot that has to go on there. Reconnect program, though, right now has got money that's available. Telecommunications Infrastructure Loans and Loan Guarantee Program, that's another big one with the USDA. 5G Fund for Rural America. I was not aware of this one, but there's funds that are available to bring 5G mobile broadband service to rural areas that would be unlikely to otherwise see deployment of 5G. I was not aware of that. There's an Alaska plan. Connect America Fund, broadband loop support, and then the one that we hear most about is the Connect America Fund Phase 2 or CAF 2 auction. That was an auction process, a reverse auction. And that's winding down, may have even wound down. I think maybe the last money was allocated from that because RDOF overtook that. Then let's see what else we got here. We got E-Rate. This is a huge program that provides funds, again, for telecom services to schools and libraries. Lifeline program that's helping to provide subsidies for end users for phone service and broadband service. And RDOF, again, this is what overtook CAF 2. So this was a reverse auction that took place, I think, last year. This was completed maybe it was 2019, can't remember. Time flies, right, when you're in a pandemic. So I can't remember if it was 2019 or 2020, but RDOF, the auction took place, and then the people that won the auction applied or said that the FCC is responding to most of those that have won the auction. In some cases, they're throwing them out. In other cases, they're going back and saying, hey, you need to change your long form application. And in some cases, they're saying, okay, you're going to get the money. So that's where we are on RDOF. Table 3, large broadband program estimated funding. So again, I highlighted a few here. Community Connect. This is for the USDA. 35 million was appropriated. Looks like 15 million was obligated, and about 19 million was outlaid. So I'm not sure how there's more outlaid than obligated, but that's the figures I have. Again, USD Reconnect, still a lot of money. So $655 million available. 1 billion. Again, this must be on a year basis. Maybe this is what was allocated over time versus just in the last year. So maybe 655 million last year. 1.2 billion obligated funding, and then total broadband funding outlaid 4,120,000. Telecommunications infrastructure, another big one with the USDA, 690 million was appropriated, 98.5 million obligated, and again, a larger number here, 140,600,000 outlaid. So again, maybe that's over time. The 5G fund, 0 and 0. So I don't know if they've got zeros. So it's not like they're saying there's no information. So I don't know if maybe nothing has been obligated or allocated there. Then CAF2, 447 million, almost 448 million obligated. Total broadband related outlaid fund, 144,950 million. Excuse me, 144,950,000. And then it says here, not applicable due to FCC funding structure as far as total appropriated funding, and it says the same thing for these other programs, and I'm wondering if that's because the FCC, I believe these funds, I know CAF2 and RDOF, and I think E-rate as well, all come from USF funds. So that would be the little junk fee amount that you have on your bill, on your telephone bill, that is to go towards this. So that's where that money is coming from. So it's not coming from taxes, so maybe that's why they don't really have the appropriated funding. It's just something that's within the USF funds that are collected. And that's going to vary depending on how many people have phone service, and then they try to adjust the rate up or down depending on how many people have phone service. And obviously, as fewer and fewer people have phone service, traditional landline phone service, for example, or even cell phone service, and as broadband gets greater and greater, we're trying to pay for broadband services with USF funds that are being collected on telephone service. It's getting out of whack. So the percentage have been going up and up. They're actually looking right now to see what they can do to adjust the USF funding system so that it will better, match as far as broadband. So they're looking at maybe somehow relating, collecting those funds from broadband services as opposed to telephone services. And you can see here what we've got. So here's the CAF2. Again, you can see the amounts there. And then E-rate, this is huge. So you got like $2.5 billion in that E-rate program, and 1.8 billion has been allocated. That's right. And then RDOF, 0 and 0 at this point, because like I said, I think they probably have some amount now that's been committed or obligated to various providers. There are some providers have been told, yes, you're going to get these funds, but they don't have that on here yet. 2020 outlaid funding by program. Again, you can see E-rate way ahead of everything else, and Lifeline as well. So these are two kind of subsidy programs. You've got your schools and libraries here for E-rate. You've got your end users for Lifeline, and you've got some others here. So you can see CAFs up there. COVID telehealth fund. There was a lot of money that was put out to help improve telehealth services during the pandemic. Got your CAF2, phase 2 auction, and Alaska, and a few other things in here, Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico. Outlayed funding by program. This USDA Telecommunications Infrastructure Program was quite high at 140 million, 140 million, 600,000 or so. Distance learning and telemedicine, again, those were primarily COVID pandemic-related relief funds. And you got Community Connect, that's also USDA, Rural Broadband Access, and the USDA Reconnect program. This is all USDA. Here's, as far as states, this is the USDA funds that were outlaid by state. You can see Texas and California got the most money. You can see basically by the color, darker states, New York got some, and some of these lighter states not as much. But this is the amount of money, because Puerto Rico got some, Alaska got a good amount. That's the amount of money. Then we've got the per capita. So we saw Texas and California had a lot of money. Of course, they got a lot of people as well. And with per capita, we've got Alaska is up at the top, and you got your Dakotas up here. We're looking at, this is the amount per capita. So $3.68 per person, up to $252, for like maybe somewhere like Alaska, 253. Funding use. In fiscal year 2020, the USDA and FCC together outlaid $2.619 billion for digital inclusion and adoption, including subsidized internet service, and $2.322 billion for infrastructure deployment. It's a lot of money. Between the two, only one program, the FCC Rural Healthcare Fund, reported outlaying funds for planning, data, or mapping, resulting in less than 1 million outlaid. So that's going to change quite a bit, because with the Biden infrastructure bill that passed, they're improving mapping right now. The FCC is looking at that mapping, but also some of the initial funds that are going to be allocated for that. It's like $100 million that goes to each state, and then $100 million that's broken up among territories. And a lot of that's going to be going to planning. Really, almost probably all of it is what the states are going to use that for, in getting their broadband offices up to speed, making sure they're hiring people, getting mapping and data in place so that they can properly allocate those funds. So I think we'll be seeing quite a bit of that in the next report. FCC and USDA fiscal year 2020 outlaid funding for infrastructure deployment and digital inclusion adoption. You can see here the FCC funds. The dark blue is inclusion adoption, and this would be infrastructure here in the gray, so you can see the breakdown there. USDA is more about the infrastructure deployment and less about digital inclusion. So the FCC spent more on getting people to adopt or getting that included. And again, some of that's with, I don't know if that's with USF funds that's being allocated there. FCC outlaid funding for infrastructure deployment by state. You can see Texas, again, big there because big state, lots of people. And then this is digital inclusion by state. Again, Texas, California, New York, some of the higher ones there. They got small broadband programs. Again, only 3 of them reported to this year's request. They primarily funded planning, data, or mapping efforts. So you got your Denali Commission that provides critical utilities, infrastructure, and economic support throughout Alaska. U.S. Department of Interior is working to help connect tribal communities to broadband internet through the National Tribal Broadband Grant. And the National Science Foundation, the goal of this project is to select, launch, and oversee 5 proof-of-concept efforts to deploy novel broadband technology solutions to both rural and urban underserved communities. I wonder if they were involved in 5G development. I'm not sure what they're working on. Then you've got your programs here, Denali, DOI, and NSF. And small broadband, so here's the estimated funding for that. I kind of buzzed through that. I thought something else was interesting here. Multi-use programs. So these are going to be the programs that do more than just broadband, the ones that are really hard to track, and you can see that in the data that was returned or not returned. Many programs invest in broadband as one of many eligible funding uses. Many multi-use programs noted challenges with isolating the portion of funds dedicated to broadband-related purposes from those allocated for non-broadband purposes. So hopefully now that they've noted that, and the NTIA has asked them about this and said, hey, we got to do this report every year, hopefully they're now putting in place ways to that when they allocate funds, they're going to make sure that they're counting where it's going. That would be my expectation. We'll see. And then you've got, see, a lot of these are, it's not necessarily related to broadband, but it could be used for broadband, like housing block grants, for example, but there could be a broadband aspect of that. Neighborhood network, public housing grants, those kinds of things. Rural housing service. And then there's the table that shows these multi-use programs and the estimated funding eligible for broadband, and you can see where they have the issue here. So in some cases, like we've got this ARC right here, they do have some figures here on what was related to broadband or was allocated, so they've got that. But in a lot of cases, it's not provided or unknown. So you can see lots of not provideds. In some cases they do have it, but lots of not provided, especially down here, not provided, unknown, or zeros. Thinking the zero probably means we don't know. Or maybe it's possible that there was some broadband funds in prior years, but if it's unknown, I don't know how they'd have a dollar amount there anyway. So you see lots of that, unknown, not provided, not provided. So funding use. While most multi-use programs do not currently collect and report on broadband-specific data, the Appalachian Regional Commission, or ARC, provided detailed broadband infrastructure development or deployment funding data. So that's the one that had that data there. And these are the states covered, and you can see the ones that got the most funding, Kentucky by far getting the most there. And those are some figures there. So between roughly 50,000 to 7.8 million are what these colors are indicating. And then current state of measuring connection. Over time, the Access Broadband Annual Report will work to measure residents connected as a result of federal broadband support and USF programs and estimate the impact of investments on local economies. So over time, but not yet. Such an undertaking will take multiple years to build towards. This year's data call was designed to understand the current state of data collection and reporting on connection. So again, trying to figure out what it is that they don't know. Broadband availability, being physically located in close proximity to broadband, that makes sense, can be measured by the type of deployment effort or the level of quality of service available. This year, the OICG requested data on households and businesses passed by infrastructure and households and businesses included in the proposed funded service area. Broadband usage, so once you build it, are people using it? Usage of broadband infrastructure once it's available. Usage can be measured in many ways and may vary depending on specific programmatic objectives. This year's data request asked programs to provide data on households and businesses projected to subscribe to available broadband service. And both of these say, well, this one says businesses passed by infrastructure. Oh, and households and businesses included in the proposed funded service area. So even if it hasn't been built yet, they're saying they would include that. That doesn't make sense to me. So why would you include broadband availability if it's a household or business included in a proposed funded service area? Because it's not really there yet. And this one says, as far as usage, households or businesses projected to subscribe to available broadband service. Again, that doesn't make sense. Why not wait until somebody's actually using it to count that? Broadband programs are not currently required to collect consistent outcome-based measures, one of the issues that they have. Broadband availability. So only 7 programs reported the number of households and businesses located in proposed funded service areas. So you got CAP 2. You got the Reconnect, so those are 2 big ones. That's a lot of what was put out there. You got telecom infrastructure from USDA also. Got the Alaska, the ARC one here, area development also, that Alaska one, and the Community Connect from USDA. You can see there's not much there compared to these. And then broadband usage, only 6 programs reported on the number of households and businesses projected to subscribe to broadband as a result of fiscal year 20 funding. So again, maybe they're looking at what was done in 20 and then the impact this is going to have in 2021 or later, maybe. Because again, this is the first report and it's looking at 2020. Projected number of households subscribed as a result of fiscal year 20 outlaid funding. And for Lifeline, that's 6 million or so. Reconnect, 110, I'm assuming this is millions. It doesn't say anything other than that. So 110,000. Telecom infrastructure, 19,000. Power initiative for ARC, area development, and community connect. You can see the numbers there. And this is residential and business, I believe. Let's see. Yeah, business would be the light blue. Dark blue is residential. I got some alternative measure stuff in here. I understand that. And, then they go through the challenges here just to finish up the report. They say the challenges of tracking federal broadband investments. There are variation in the data, agency constraints, timing and complexity, so lots of challenges. Path forward, I've got some recommendations here. So promote consistency across programs, very important. To the extent practicable, consistent standards across the federal government, including for recipient and subrecipient reporting, can support effective broadband-related data collection. So for the IIJA and the BEAD, Broadband Equity and Access Deployment Program, for that, there's going to be entities and sub-entities. So the entities are going to be the states or a territory, for example. So those are the grantees. Then you've got sub-grantees or sub-recipients under those. That could be a telephone company, a cable company, a municipality, electric co-op, those kinds of things. So they're all going to have to report upstream to the NTIA the money that they're getting. Well, the money will be known, I guess, by the state, but the money how they're using that money, and they're going to have to verify all kinds of information, including the speeds that people are getting, latency that people are getting. There's going to be a lot of reporting that's going to be involved in this. Leverage open data initiatives. Agencies are required to collect and submit information about awards, incorporating broadband-related data requirements into those efforts. So they need to start looking at if they're getting money and some of that's allocated to broadband, they need to track that. They need to be able to report on that when it's been given out. Identify sources and alternatives. The NTIA will evaluate alternative strategies to gather data for this report, including using data from new FCC maps. So the new FCC maps are coming. Those have to be out prior to any money from the Biden infrastructure bill being allocated. And those maps are supposed to include a lot of information that we don't have available now. Specifically, I believe, down to the address level, which is, does this address have broadband available? Who are the broadband providers if it does? What speeds are they providing? What speeds are they advertising? And then also, what speeds are people getting? And then what is the latency that they're promising? What is the latency that people are actually getting? So I think there'll be speed test information in that. So there'll be a lot of data there. And then I'm sure they'll be able to track who has broadband at those addresses as well. And then they conclude the report there with basically the same information. They just don't have enough information to track it, and they're going to be looking to produce replicable annual reports moving forward. So anyway, this is a good start, and I can understand the reasoning for putting out a report with not a lot of information right now. You got to figure out what it is that you don't know first, and then you got to put the processes and methods in place to collect that data. So hopefully next year when this report comes out, there'll be a lot more information. We'll be able to see some impact, especially on the planning and mapping side from the infrastructure bill that just passed. We should have hopefully better information on some of the funds that are being given out in late this year in 2022 as far as, let's say, Reconnect program or ARPA. That's another big one. I also did something on the American Recovery or I think it's American Rescue Plan Act, that funds are available on that. So I will go ahead and post a link to this report as well as a link to the USDA and the ARPA broadcasts that I did that have funds right now that are available. So if you're looking for funding, if you are a state or a service provider and you're looking for funding for broadband, there are programs out right now. And obviously you want to be looking forward to the infrastructure bill that just passed, but it is going to be probably mid next year before you can even apply for that. So there are programs that you can apply for right now, so I will go ahead and link to those. So thanks for joining me. If you enjoyed this, go ahead and give me a thumbs up on YouTube and make sure you subscribe if you're not, if you want to be notified when I'm live. I'm live every day with a report like this, and then also Tech Tuesdays every Tuesday. Click the little bell to be notified, and then you will be notified on your browser or on your phone if you have those set for YouTube notifications. Thanks again, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.